Welcome back to the course Globalization and Housing Risks of Chinese Young People. This is the third part of the course, and you can find the links of the other two videos in the video description. This video is also good for independent watch for audience who are interested in the housing problems of young people or housing policies of China. As I have talked about in the first video, China has had a planning economy before the 1980s reform, and it is a planning bureau instead of autonomous market entities are deciding what to invest and what to produce. Housing construction was deemed as means of consumption rather than means of production. Therefore, it was placed second in the planning bureau's agenda. Housing construction is limited, and there is a wide housing shortage problem. Many urban families live in single-room flat which has only shared toilets and kitchens. We have saw the first picture before. Many families had occupied this courtyard house because there is not enough housing was constructed. Very often, 3 generations have lived in one room and they have to use public toilets. The limited construction of residential buildings are carried out by public work units and the municipalities. You can see here a famous project in Shanghai called Chaoyang Xinchun. Public housing was rented to employees with a nominal rent, and who can get a home and how big the home is. It's not decided by how much they can pay, but on a series of criteria indicating how much they are contributive to the society. You can see the distribution standards of a public organization in 1955 in this slide. When an individual has a higher position in the hierarchy, they can be allocated a larger office and housing quota per person, and the rent of a small apartment or a big apartment it is not very much different. Now let's look at what's happened in the housing reform. The policies in housing reform is very complex and have different focuses for different periods. But one of the main strengths is to transfer housing tenure from public renting housing, like the blue bar here, to private owning, like the red bar, indicated in this graph. Another important goal is to transfer the ways of allocation from administrative allocation to buy-in. Real estate developers supersede work units as main housing providers. Welfare housing from employers are no longer available, and almost all young adults who wish to be moved out and establish their own households have to buy a commodity housing from the market, and subsidized tenures are very limited. This table shows a collection of housing distribution status in different years, and this was collected from the literature. Because this slide was not prepared for online use, I didn't attach reference here, but it can be found elsewhere. The percentage of public rental housing peaked in 1978, then kept declined to 28% in 2000 and 3.4% in 2011. It's not only due to a sale of public housing to sitting tenants, like what happened in the UK and the Netherlands, but also due to its stagnation comparing to the rapid growth of owner-occupied housing. The percentage of private-owned housing was merely 35% in 1949 and declined to 25% in 1978. It reached around 50% in 1996, kept increasing to 75% in 2011. Housing price increases very rapidly in China. You can see the blue line in the right graph. It increases 10% or even 20% annually. This rapid appreciation of housing value is linked closely to the process of globalization and the free flow of capital all over the globe. Because Chinese economy is largely dependent on export, it has to keep the currency exchange rate competitive. Chinese government apply active monetary policies to peg the exchange rate Chinese yuan to US dollars to make sure the price of its products are attractive to international buyers. Therefore, when Federal Reserve in US ordered to issue more US dollars, the Chinese banks have to match it. The financial industries are also developed, and policies to facilitate capital flows are initiated to respond to the need of international trades and foreign investment. Let's look at the determinants of young people's housing opportunities. In different periods, housing researchers asked about who has more opportunities to live in better housing conditions and what are those people's attributes. In welfare period, it's a senior, married, families with larger size are more likely to be allocated housing and better housing. In welfare and dual period, Communist Party of Chinese members, cadres, which equivalent managers and government officials, and higher administrative ranking are more likely to have the chance to buy a home with a large subsidy. After the market reform started and commodity housing dominates the market, there is a socialist, Victor Lee, who proposed a market transition thesis. And this thesis suggests that in the transition process from redistributive economy to market economy, stratification mechanisms, which decides who get better opportunities, will also move from redistributive variables to market variables, such as income and occupation. So I tested this thesis in my own research using data from 2010 Chinese General Social Survey. The results show that all these market variables are insignificant in predicting young people's opportunity to become homeowners. So what are the significant variables? The result is interesting. The CPC membership of the parents is significant, and the hukou type and hukou site is important. Some of you might have heard about the term hukou. It's a household registration system which tied up an individual's welfare access to his or her status of residence at birth. Therefore, one's hukou type, which is rural and urban, or hukou site, local or migrant, were all redistributive variables which are decided at the time of birth. So my research showed that redistributive variables rather than market variables determines Chinese young people's opportunity to become homeowners, which is an indicator of better housing conditions and assets. But this finding is somewhat different from findings in other studies which use all-age Chinese urban residents as research objects. Why is that? Why only young people? I think it's because under the background of high housing prices, the savings of young people are not enough, and for people who achieved home ownership in young age, they must rely more on the assets accumulated by their parents in previous decades instead of their own income in past several years. Therefore, the attributes of the family backgrounds had a more significant influence on young people's home ownership. But that insight is not enough for research, right? So in the second half of my PhD research, I looked into the role of housing intergenerational transfers. There is in-kind transfers, which is the parents to allow their adult children to live at home for free. But in my research, I focused on financial transfers, which is using parents' financial contribution to help children to acquire home ownership. Because it's not only a way to help young people to save time and money, but it also can help to build up the children's asset immediately. Chinese society is characteristic with a high level of participation in housing intergenerational transfers. Although the national data is absent, surveys in individual cities shed light on the prevalence of intergenerational transfers. In Beijing, 40% of young homeowners, including locals and migrants, used financial transfers from their parents. The percentage is higher if focused on the local hukou. In another survey, also in Beijing, 80% of the local respondents received transfers from their parents, and 28% of them received transfers of the whole price paid by their parents. In Nanjing, which is the capital city of Jiangsu province in the south, 72% of local young adults received transfers, in contrast of 64% of the migrants to do so. 52% of the property value is paid by parental transfers for the local young adults, while it's only 26% for migrants. In my own research, I did a field work in Chongqing. That is a second-tier city in the middle of China. Chongqing is also the city where I was born and where I was currently working. It looked like this before the reform on the left picture, and now it's a modern metropolitan area with a lot of skyscrapers and good public facilities. I did 31 in-depth interviews to both parents and adult children to understand their own experiences on receiving and providing intergenerational transfers. The participants were selected by a purposive sampling method under the principle of maximum diversity. So I targeted and categorized three groups of young people: locals, urban migrants who moved from another urban area to Chongqing, and rural migrants who moved from the countryside to Chongqing. All of them were born with a rural hukou, but now some of them have transferred and have an urban hukou now. Within each group, I recruited a sample with maximum diversity in terms of age, gender, occupation, education, income level, and housing and living arrangements. And I tried to find people who are received transfers and who are not received transfers, and parents who did transfers and did not transfer. And these numbers are not representative. These interviews reveal that the HIT is a generalized reciprocity. Intergenerational transfers of home ownership are exchanges between parents' financial support and children's generalized support in the future. So generalized reciprocity means that the children do not need to compensate parents' help in the same amount of money or not even money, but can be in any forms such as care, accompanying, instrumental help, or money depending on the need of the parents and the available resources of the children. These exchanges, although not usually discussed openly in the course of negotiation, are consensually widespread among parents and young adults. If the parents have ability to help in the children's home, they are believed to have the responsibility to do so, and the children are expected to reciprocate in the future. And if the parents refuse to do so, it's acceptable for their children to fulfill only a limited role in aged care. But in situations where parents are not affluent enough to help, their rights towards children's age support should not be affected. Some young adults had chosen to refuse or not request transfers in order to avoid undesirable reciprocity and maintain their autonomy. The different public welfare received by urban and rural background families results in different opinions towards housing intergenerational transfers and different patterns of reciprocity. Parents whose background is rural, and among them even those established migrants who now transfer their hukou into a local urban hukou and have access to public welfare, have stronger aspirations and behavioral tendencies to help their children in home purchases. They tend to believe that to help in their children's home purchase is their duty, because in their experiences, family members are the most reliable resources for welfare, and as these parents rarely received any support from the state institutions. When rural parents make transfers and help their children buy a home, they often move into the poverty and maintain intense financial and instrumental exchanges with their children. In contrast, urban families believe that to help their children buy a home is just doing them a favor. Urban parents keep their separate residence and do not expect the regular financial return unless it's in emergency. In my research, I also found that the gender of the adult child play an important role in deciding the transfer patterns of the family. Parents often prepare a home for sons in advance, and there is no help to daughters or merely provide interest-free loans. Young women is not completely passive in this process, particularly women in urban single-child families. They can actively seek help from parents or co-owning with husbands by sharing the mortgage loan payment. If both of the strategy is not available, we will own no housing assets and depend on the husbands. This phenomenon is a legacy of the patrilineal family welfare system. The man's family provides residence and other living resources for the young couple. In exchange, its husband's parents receive aged care from the couple, and the offspring of the young couple will carry out the family line of the husbands. This patrilineal system decides that men receive more housing assets than women from their families, and together with a gender gap in earning power, men also own more housing assets than women. A national representative survey shows that only 38% of women owns housing assets, while 67% of men do so. Among married populations, 13% women owns housing assets, while the number for men is 52%. Among unmarried population, 17 women owns housing assets and 20% of men. This patrilineal system and the patriarchal power relations had been partially weak in the socialist era, but now is having a coming back after the reform. As many welfare and resource allocations were given up by the public sector, and families and private sectors are taking over. Finally, let's look at the social coordinate framework. In this course of globalization and social risks, you have also learned about the welfare state. In my research, I use this graph to show the interconnectedness of welfare state, family reciprocity, and home ownership. There is a trade-off between welfare state and home ownership because tax contributions to pension scheme and private spending on home ownership are mutually exclusive for families to offset their long-term risks. Other things being equal, the more one pays for social security contributions, the less one can afford for housing purchase and vice versa. There is also a trade-off between state and family as welfare provider. The former relies on services purchased from professional institutions and paid by public funds, whereas the latter depends on help from individuals with no monetary compensation for the service. In countries where public pensions are more generous, the elderly tend to be independent of their offspring, particularly in financial terms. On the other hand, in countries where public expenditure on social security is low, intergenerational support is more common. In developing countries where social protection is underdeveloped, extended and joint families are common ways of residence and main resource of welfare and protection for individuals. The trade-off between state and family in welfare provision also works the other way round. In developed countries with a family-oriented culture, such as in East Asia countries like Japan and South Korea, the development of the welfare state is confined. Family reciprocity includes the reciprocity within one generation, like between the husband and wife. In such countries, the state policies expect the family members to help each other instead of to develop a better functioning social care institution. On the basis of the two trade-offs outlined above, a widespread intergenerational transfer in home ownership and the consequent phenomenon of reciprocity can be expected. Individual families are forced to own a home as a source of private safety net, And since demand is rigid, house prices will rise, or at least remain stable, making housing a very attractive investment, even for those who do not need accommodation. In general, a large lump sum is required as mortgage down payment to enter home ownership. First-time buyers would have to seek financial help, most likely from families and close friends who would not ask for collateral or whose terms might be more flexible. Family and friends are willing to pool resources together so that they can derive more benefits from the never-falling housing market. This model works best for parents and adult children, as the former have savings and the latter have future earning power. Gender is an independent dimension in this framework, and there can be a distinguished gender division in any of the three elements of the framework. You have probably learned in this course or somewhere else that the welfare state in Northern Europe is the most gender neutral ones, where the governments provide childcare, encourage employment of women so that women can maintain a household by themselves. In the rest of the developed world, women to some extent are treated as dependent of their husband and access welfare mainly as family members of the males, and Japan is an extreme case for this situation. In my own research, I have shown to you how the family reciprocity between the seniors' aged care and the young adults' housing need is carried out along the line of sons. Therefore, in China, males are in an advantaged position to receive housing intergenerational transfers, and the ratio of male homeowners is much higher than the ratio of female homeowners. But the Chinese males have a higher pressure on giving money to buy homes, and that becomes a burden of many families with small children. Based on the explanation of this framework that I have given so far, I can present two ideal types of social coordination. Type 1 is characterized by close intergenerational relationships between generations, where they have intense exchange in financial, instrumental, and emotional support. A tenure-biased housing system with a dominance of home ownership and a residual welfare state and division of gender roles. And type 2 is characterized by relatively independent intergenerational relationships, a tenure-neutral housing system with adequate provision and comparable rights in the rental and home ownership sector, a generous welfare state to both old and young, and no gender divisions. Type 2 social coordination differs from Type 1 in that part of the resources, income and wealth produced by citizens is derived beyond the boundary of the families, and it's distributed on a larger scale. It could be the state, pension fund entities, etc. This scaling up of coordination helps modern states to facilitate investment and developments, offset risks, and improve the well-being of the population. So I call it modern social coordination. But each country has its own specific configurations of the four dimensions, which eventually merge to form different styles of social coordination between the two ideal types. This is all for this. We do not have a Q&A section, but you are welcome to leave your comments and questions below, and I'll try to respond to them when time is available. Thank you.